Good morning. We'll call the K through 12 Higher Education CIP Joint Subcommittee to order. This morning, actually, first let's start with roll call. Madam Secretary, can you take the roll?
Senator Canizaro. Senator Dondero Loop. Here. Senator Neal. Here. Senator Severs-Gansert. Senator Titus. Here. Assemblywoman Howdigi. Assemblywoman Kasama. Here. Assemblyman Miller. Here. Assemblywoman Monroe Moreno. Here. Assemblyman O'Neill. Here. Assemblywoman Peters. Assemblyman Yeager. Here. Chair Backus.
And please mark Assemblywoman Howdigi and Assemblywoman Peters present when they arrive, and also Senator Canizaro is here as well. This morning, we're going to start with 15 minutes of public comment, just because we anticipate there's probably going to be a lot going on this morning before we have to go to floor. And I would ask those that are giving public comment during the first 15 minutes, if you don't mind allowing others to go if we have time at the end to give public comment. So first, we will start here in Carson City with public comment. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Dawn Echeverry, Etcheverry, and I'm the president of the Nevada State Education Association. The Nevada State Education Association has been the voice of Nevada educators for over 120 years. Elected officials from both sides of the aisle have talked about record appropriations for K-12 education. While this is good news, it is important to note the severity of the issue in public schools caused by chronic underfunding, as well as the work that remains to reach optimal funding and ensure public dollars go where they are most needed. This is why NSCA has been saying it's time for 20. Time for 20 means a 20% raise for every Nevada educator, $20 an hour minimum wage in our schools, and an average class size of 20 students. Since the COVID pandemic, educators left their jobs in record numbers due to low pay and severely low morale. At the midpoint of the school year, there are still thousands of school vacancies, and with many more positions being covered by long-term substitutes, or in some of our rural areas, privately contracted virtual teachers. A December report of the Economic Policy Institute found there is a widespread national teacher shortage that is especially severe here in Nevada. They found that the current shortage is not the result of insufficient number of qualified teachers, but rather low pay and the increasing stressful work environment. An average pay differential between teachers and similar college graduates in the job market has grown by 23.5%. In his recommended budget, Governor Lombardo highlighted a record investment in education, and it is true he recommends increasing per pupil funding by about $2,000 next year. However, this is still $4,693 less per pupil than the amount the Funding Commission identified as optimal. Instead of approaching optimal funding, money that could be used for our schools is being held back. $1.6 billion in the rainy day fund and $733 million in the education stabilization fund. With billions of dollars available for public education and educator vacancies at crisis levels, GovRec included no specific proposal to address educator shortage or salaries. Contrast this with other states who have similar and available resources. In early 2022, New Mexico Governor Lujan Grisham announced an average raise of 20% for all New Mexico educators. Last year, New Mexico saw a 34% drop in teacher vacancies, a direct result of salary increase and investment in the hardworking New Mexico educators. Nevada could see those same results, but it will take bold action and true investment. That is why NSCA has been calling on Nevada's elected leaders to fund Time for 20. And time again, we have pointed to significant resources available. With billions of dollars in reserves, there is more than enough to cover a 20% across the board educator raise, estimated by the commission to cost about $650 million a year. Instead, dollars meant for schools are being stashed away. A proposal by the legislative Democrats have added $250 million to educator raises, representing a good down payment on time for 20. However,
Thank you so much. Are you about to wrap it up? I thought you were
am.
going to wrap it up earlier, so I didn't
Sorry.
want to cut you off.
However, due to the mechanisms of the proposal and the new funding formula, certain school districts still won't have the resources for these raises. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, if we can leave public comment to 2 minutes, we have a lot of people today, and we're only allowing 15 early on, and then hopefully we'll get some more public comment at the end today.
Madam Chair, Chris Daly, Nevada State Education Association. The Commission on School Funding was created by SB 543 in the 2019 session and charged with recommending optimal funding for Nevada schools. They utilized a study conducted by Augenblick, Palick, and Associates from 2018 and quantified the level of spending recommended in that report. 3 weeks ago, Chair Guy Hobbs presented the Commission's report, attempting to synthesize much of the 3 years of their work in their 400-page report in only a handful of slides. On one slide in particular, it provides a great deal of perspective on the state of education funding in Nevada, even considering an additional $1 billion appropriation in the governor's recommended budget. So if you take a look at this slide, with additional state revenue, GovRec proposes increasing per pupil funding by around $2,000. Overall increases during the pandemic years to per pupil funding in Nevada were de minimis. However, over the same time period, inflation in the cost of operating school districts has skyrocketed, increasing about 15% from 2020 to today. So inflation takes up a lion's share of the overall proposed increase to K-12 funding in GovRec. For example, actual per pupil funding in fiscal year 20 was $4,789 below optimal funding. Projected forward to 2024, even with that extra $2,000 per pupil, Nevada would still be $4,693 below optimal funding, only closing the per pupil gap to get to optimal funding by $96. Now what? In future fiscal years, while we likely won't have this level of inflation, we also aren't likely to have record surpluses. This is why it's necessary to pursue new revenue streams for public education and modernize existing revenues moving forward. The Commission on School Funding has recommended 2 new revenue streams supported by NSEA, and there are other strong proposals in the works. We encourage legislators to keep moving forward toward optimal funding, not just running in place. Meanwhile, we remain concerned about impacts of the new formula on rural districts. While all but 3 districts technically come out of the SB 543 freeze, most rural districts are still negatively affected by the new funding formula.
I hate to cut you off. Are you about done? Could you mind?
Sure thing.
Thanks.
So 8 rural districts are projected to have increases less than the cost of doing business. We hope that this committee digs into that and fixes this mechanical issue. Thank you.
Thanks. Next up, all the comment.
Good morning, Alexander Marks with the Nevada State Education Association. So with the record revenues that my colleague has just mentioned, the significant appropriations are opposed for the state education fund. And that's great news, but despite all this, it seems that much of the focus of the legislature has now shifted from increasing revenue to optimal funding for our students to demanding greater accountability and transparency. So like all education stakeholders, NSEA is supportive of greater transparency and accountability, especially when it comes to the stewardship of our public funds. Even Senator Mo Dennis in the first hearing on the funding formula stated that the second most important guiding principle was transparency. This included the creation of an annual, SB 543 created the creation of an annual report with a description of personnel employed and services provided by the district in each public school during the previous year, as well as anticipated changes moving forward. So districts are required to post this information on their website, and schools are required to provide written copies to parents of each child at each school. So in response to the passage of AB 495 from the 21 session, the Commission on School Funding submitted their report on optimal funding to the legislature last November. Appendix 1 of that report details how the new funding would be used as districts as it becomes available. The first priority is hiring and retention of high-quality staff in a competitive labor market. This priority aligns closely with NSEA's Time for 20. Other priorities include increasing equitable education opportunities, improving student and family supports, and investing in facilities. NSEA would caution the legislature that greater accountability cannot be measured by student performance on standardized tests. As NEASN President Vicki Kreidel said, any educator will tell you that testing-focused schools lose hours of valuable, authentic teaching prep time. This practice adds to the already high-stress job that classroom teachers now have. So with our glaring shortage, we hope accountability is instead measured by strategies that ensure our schools are filled with qualified educators who have the tools they need to ensure every Nevada student has access to a high-quality education. Accountability means using funds where they are needed most, like pay increases for every Nevada educator. Accountability means using funds where they are needed most, like class size reduction. Accountability means using funds where they are needed most, like school safety. That is why NSCA is proposing the Time for 20 campaign as well as the Respect Educators Act. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And also, I know, hopefully your public comments were the same that you submitted, and they'll be uploaded after the hearing. So thank you so much. Do we have anyone else that wishes to give public comment this morning in Carson City? If not, let's go to Las Vegas for public comment down there.
My name is Bill Hanlon. I'm here to speak about the RPDPs getting support. Nevada has a number of major issues that negatively impact public education.
Sir, do you?
The three are very much.
Sir, can you move the mic closer to your mouth? We're having a difficult time hearing you in Carson City. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nevada has a number of major issues that negatively impact public education, three of which are very much connected. A shortage of qualified teachers. For example, Nevada has had a documented shortage of math teachers since 1985, student achievement and safety in our schools. The regional professional development program's budget were cut approximately in half in the 2007 recession and never restored. Based on the teacher shortages, reduced requirements to teach, there's a greater need for content-based professional development more than ever. This committee must not only restore those budgets, but dramatically increase them. Otherwise, the billions of dollars supposedly being added to public education will be minimized. Simply put, when people don't know the words to a song, they often hum. With the shortage of teachers covering classes and less than qualified teachers teaching our students, there is an awful lot of humming happening in our classrooms. Content-based professional development can change that. Outside the parent, the most important person in a child's education is the classroom teachers. Programs are only as good as the teachers using them. Nevada clearly needs better prepared teachers. School safety is also an issue in our schools. I'd like you to think back to your high school years. If you experienced a teacher that didn't seem to know their subject matter or how to teach it or manage a classroom, students had a tendency to act up. I'm sure not anyone in this group. Our students get frustrated when they know they are not learning or understanding, and that causes them to pay less attention and act out. That acting out leads sometimes to students making very bad decisions, which takes the form of intimidation, bullying, or worse, violence. In a nutshell, not having better qualified teachers leads to less learning, low student achievement, and students acting out that lead to discipline and safety issues in our schools. Please do not minimize the state's investment in education. It's time this committee addressed the problem by ensuring teachers had access to content-based professional development, so they are getting professional development in the content they teach, how they teach it, resources that support those strategies, as well as how to assess it. That can only be accomplished by restoring and increasing the RPDP budgets. It's time we gave our students a chance. And let's be very clear. I have a math degree, so I can tell you I have a little expertise in finding percents. But last year, most districts gave teachers a raise. That resulted in the RPDPs having to absorb that cost, which means they can offer less professional development. The modest increase that's being proposed in the governor's budget will
Sir,
not
I hate to
cover
cut you off, but I
liability.
thank you for your public
The
comment,
new
and
pay
I would just
raises,
ask
PERS, and
that you go
health.
ahead and submit it to the committee secretary so we have it in full. Thank you so much, and just remember to turn your mic off when you're done.
Thank you.
And I don't believe anyone else is in Las Vegas. We have 2 more minutes, and I don't know, BPS, if there's one person on the phone that we could go ahead and take for public comment, we could do that now.
To provide public comment, press star 9 now on your phone to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last three digits, go ahead.
I'm sorry, is that me? I was pressing *69 or *9.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, honorable committee chairs and committee members. My name is Amanda Morgan, AMANDA-MORGAN. I'm the executive director of Educate Nevada Now, powered by the Rogers Foundation. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comment during today's budget hearing. Educate Nevada Now has fiercely advocated for the development of a modern K-12 funding formula that is thoughtful, adequately funded, and serves the needs of all Nevada students. We are pleased to see the proposed budget will put Nevada on track to meet the Commission on School Funding's 10-year plan to reach national average funding levels. Although ENN did not agree with every aspect of the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan, or PCFP, we wholeheartedly support the new formula's transition to weighted funding. ENN remains deeply concerned, however, with the Department of Education's new definition of at-risk, recently proposed under a temporary regulation that is pending final legislative approval. ENN is concerned that the proposed definition will undermine the progress and promises of the PCFP and reduce eligibility by 75% compared to the widely used proxy for at-risk free and reduced price lunch eligibility. The proposed definition accounts only for a student's ability to graduate rather than to graduate college and career ready, creating lower expectations for our at-risk students. By limiting eligibility to the bottom 20%, schools will struggle to meet the needs of all their students that need additional resources. ENN has shared its concerns with members of the legislature, community stakeholders, and relevant boards, and hopes to see the proposed definition of at-risk revisited and revised to fully account for the needs of all Nevada's most vulnerable students. Thank you once again for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you so much, Ms. Watkins. And I don't know if you have your materials written, but if you could submit those to our committee manager, that would be greatly appreciated. Next, we will go ahead and...
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Next, we will go ahead and open the budget account 203-26009. So if Nevada Department of Education wants to make their way to the front, that'd be greatly appreciated. And start whenever you'd like. And one thing else, I know we have a pretty lengthy hearing today and a lot of questions. And so if you wish, you can go directly to the member of the committee instead of through the chair to save some time.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. It is wonderful to be here in person today. With that, we are going to present the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan. And as the deck comes up, as a reminder, this is actually a new plan. It is a plan that replaced a 52-year-old plan. So it took us as Nevadans a while to make a determination that we would move forward. And during the last 4 years, after SB 543 was put into place, the Commission on School Funding was put into place, and all the mechanisms have been moving forward. And so we look forward to presenting to you today the work that has been done by the department, by the Commission on School Funding, with the governor's recommended budget. I want to also highlight that the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan is really driven about equity, making sure that all of our students have the resources that they need to be successful. And the example that I use quite often is people get confused with equal and equity. And so if we were all to give you a pair of shoes, we would be being equal. But what if I gave you all a size 4? Every single person at the dais a size 4 pair of shoes. We gave you all a pair of shoes, but we did not meet you where you are and what you need. Some of you need a size 8. Some of you need a size 10. Some of you need a size 12. And so the formula does exactly that. It is equity driven, making sure that we recognize each and every one of our children. It is also transparent. If you've been around for a while, you've seen the slides that look like a spaghetti bowl. In the past, with the Nevada plan, it was not easy to follow, to understand how the dollars came into the state and how they were allocated to education. Accountability is a huge portion of what we are looking at today and moving forward. And then the flexibility, making sure that we recognize the individuality of all of our school districts. We have the 5th largest school district in the nation. We have an extremely large charter school population, about 60,000 students. We have our Washoe County School District, and we also have Esmeralda, which has under 100 children in the entire district. So with that, we have the pupil-centered funding plan. And as codified, it moves forward. It identifies a basic level of support for each of our pupils, and then it is adjusted at the district level to account for the local variations in cost. What makes this model different from any other budget in the state is that it is revenue-driven and correlates to economic growth to funding levels. Meaning that when there's an increase in revenues, as we have seen, there's an increase in funding available to our students. The pupil-centered funding plan combines multiple revenue sources, including local school support tax, property tax, marijuana taxes, and other revenues not identified here on this slide, but we do have a slide that has all of them. And the funds are received in the State Education Fund and then allocated into the 4 tiers. It's important to note that the state allocates funds to school districts, but the pupil-centered funding plan specifically provides flexibility as those funds are allocated. Also housed within the State Education Fund is the State Stabilization Account. The State Stabilization Account is funded through 2 mechanisms: unobligated balances from the pupil-centered funding plan account, either from lower than projected enrollment counts or through a higher than projected revenues. And that's what we've seen happen to date. Also included in the state stabilization account are transfers from school districts whose ending fund balance is higher than 16.6%. In the event that the total funding for the Education Stabilization Account exceeds 15% of the State Education Fund, funding is then transferred as an alternative funding mechanism for the pupil-centered funding plan. So with that, I would like to turn the time over to our new Deputy Superintendent over our Student Investment Division, Megan Peterson.
Good morning, members of the committee. Megan Peterson for the record. Moving into the next portion of our presentation, this slide identifies the 20 revenues plus additional transfers from reserve or net proceeds that carry forward, as the superintendent previously mentioned. For fiscal year 24, the governor had recommended a budget that put forward $5.3 billion in funding, and in fiscal year 25, $5.5 billion in funding. These are based on revenues that were projected during the December Economic Forum, and these numbers will be updated again after their next meeting. Before moving on to the overview of the tiers of funding and the recommended levels, I wanted to go over what we are referring to as the baseline funding mechanism that was established by the 2019 legislature and modified by the 2021 legislature. This mechanism was established to reduce the fiscal cliff that many LEAs may have experienced as we transition to the pupil-centered funding plan. This mechanism is implemented when a school district or charter school is expected to receive less funding through the pupil-centered funding plan than they would have received in fiscal year 2020. During the 2021 legislature, as I mentioned, this was modified and moved from an aggregate level of funding to a per-pupil calculation. Because of the nature of the funding mechanism, in order to make LEAs who qualify for the baseline funding mechanism whole, all LEAs are funded through the pupil-centered funding plan are proportionally reduced in order to reallocate the funding to bring those who were below the threshold to their respective 2020 per pupil amounts. In fiscal year 2023, there were 9 LEAs who were funded using the fiscal year 20 baseline funding mechanism, and with the governor's executive recommended budget, 3 districts were funded through the 2020 per pupil amounts. As we mentioned a little earlier in the presentation, there are 4 tiers of funding identified in the pupil-centered funding plan. This includes auxiliary funding in Tier 1, which includes transportation and food services, local special education funding, which provides funding for each school district's local maintenance of effort funding for special education in Tier 2. State special education funding is applied as a weighted formula, but funded separately from the pupil-centered funding plan due to maintenance of state fiscal support requirements from the federal government. The third tier of funding provides a baseline of funding for all LEAs. This funding is provided to all students to provide a base level of education. The base level funding is adjusted through different factors to account for each county's unique makeup. And lastly, we have Tier 4, which provides weighted funding for the 3 currently identified weighted categories. Looking a little closer at Tier 1, this again provides food services and transportation. These are based on expenditures collected from the school districts in their 387-303 fiscal reports. It's a 4-year average of these expenditures, and this is the only time that expenditures are addressed with the exception of the local education throughout the revenue-driven model. Currently, inflation is not funded in either year of the biennium for either of these 2 services. This slide identifies the 4-year average of expenditures based on the reported information as noted. If you'll recall from the earlier slide, this is one of 2 places, as I mentioned, where the expenditures are used to determine allocations. This funding amount is subtracted from the total revenues projected, which then flow to the remaining tiers of funding. As noted, there is no inflation that is funded for this, and so fiscal year 24 and 25 are recommended at $194 million for each year. Tier 2, as I mentioned as well, is also based on expenditures. This is not a 4-year average, but the amounts that are reported in base year expenditure reports. This is, as I mentioned, the funding that school districts and charter schools use to pay for their portion of the special education funding. This, please note, does not include inflation as well, as these are funds that are intended to meet maintenance of effort requirements in school districts. And so the recommendation is not to include inflation in order to not necessarily increase their requirement for meeting maintenance of effort. Before moving to the next tier of funding, I wanted to take a moment and review enrollment with you. Enrollment is used to determine an LEA's allocation by multiplying the per pupil amount by the projected enrollment for each LEA, or local education agency. Enrollment is projected using a 4-year average of the quarterly average daily enrollment. Average daily enrollment is collected quarterly from LEAs and is a calculation of the total number of students enrolled during a specified time. For those who may wonder about the difference between enrollment and attendance, think of it as in terms of your employment. You may be employed with a company or agency, but you may not necessarily attend every day because of vacation or sick or some other situation. So in a similar fashion, enrollment is when a student is expected to be enrolled in a school, and attendance is when they are physically in attendance. And so for funding purposes, we base it on enrollment because the anticipation and hope would be that students are in class every day. For the upcoming biennium, enrollment is projected to grow 0.1% in each year. And you can see those projected values here on this slide. These numbers will again be updated after the April 1st enrollment counts are received in order to ensure we have accurate projections for the upcoming biennium. Moving to Tier 3 and quickly reviewing this calculation, we have the statewide base per pupil amount. The statewide base, like its namesake, provides the base level of funding for each local education agency. The statute provides several options for calculating this each year, but in simple terms, we take the prior year base amount, apply an inflation adjustment, and an alternative adjustment, either revenue or enrollment driven, to calculate the new base year amount. As part of the governor's recommended executive budget, a revenue adjustment was utilized this time, as it allowed us to implement a 16% increase instead of the 0.1% that would have been tied to enrollment. In terms of the state budget building process, you could equate this to the base portion of the budget that is adjusted for increased costs of maintaining services. Taking into account the enrollment and the revenues that we were looking at in earlier slides, the estimated per pupil funding amount for fiscal year '24 is $8,613, and for fiscal year '25, $9,039. These amounts will be multiplied by the projected enrollment to calculate the total base statewide funding for each LEA. And for fiscal year '24, you can see that that equates to approximately $4 billion. In fiscal year '25, following that same methodology, we are looking at $4.3 billion. Also within Tier 3 is what's called the adjusted base. This is an additional amount of funding that's allocated, which, if we're continuing the state's example for the budget system, would include maintenance adjustments as applied to the base funding. In the case of the pupil-centered funding plan, adjustments are made to the statewide base to account for economies of scale and certain market efficiencies within each district. These adjustments are added to or subtracted from the statewide base to determine the adjusted base funding, which is added to the previous amount that we were just discussing. These would be analogous to maintenance or the M150 adjustments in the state's budget building process. Looking at those two adjustments a little bit more, the attendance area adjustment is an adjustment that accounts for increased costs associated with per pupil educating a student in a lower population density area. Generally speaking, attendance areas are equated with population centers in each county. And for an example, Elko County has a total of 11 attendance areas. They include Carlin, Elko, Independence, and Mound Valley, just to name a few. And in terms of a county like Nye, we would be looking at Armagosa Valley, Beatty, and Duckwater. This factor is applied as a multiplier to the funding to account for the costly economies of scale in more rural locations. Looking at the next adjustment, the Nevada Cost of Education Index. This was developed to account for variations in counties of this state and in the cost of living and the cost of labor for each school district. This is a district-specific adjustment to account for the variations between counties and reflects the increased or decreased costs of attracting employees to an area. Within the Nevada Cost of Education Index, there are two components used to determine the adjustment, and these include a wage measure and a cost of goods measure. It is not a cost of living measure, but instead measures the cost of attracting staff to a region due to a variety of community factors such as location, outdoor activities, access to healthcare, shopping, or restaurants. The CWI, the Cost of Wage Index, uses regional differences in non-educator wages and is based on a recognition that if in a given region wages in a comparable profession are higher, then teacher wages would also have to be higher. The CWI calculates the regional differences by taking raw data and then using regression analysis to control for any differences attributed to worker characteristics. The cost of goods measure portion of this is based on Bureau of Economic Analysis regional price parities and represents the remaining non-wage portion of the district for portion of district and charter school funding. Subject matter experts who worked with other states around the country to develop similar indexes for other states had considered housing costs, but the adjustment responded by pushing dollars to more affluent neighborhoods, which was not the intended outcome, which is why housing is not considered in this adjustment. Taking these adjustments into account and adjusting the statewide base, in terms of fiscal year '24, the per pupil amount is averaged at $8,942, and fiscal year '25, $9,383. It's important to remember that this is an average, meaning that it's a total divided by the enrollment rather than representative of each school district's unique calculation. With that in mind, the adjusted base per pupil funding amount for fiscal year '24 is identified here. Based on the governor's recommended budget, the Nevada Cost of Education Index was recommended to have a floor of 1.0 for districts who are at or below 1, and those districts who are above 1 in the index, they receive the benefit. And in this case, that was Clark County at 1.008. As you can see, there are some charter schools in Clark County who also receive the adjustment. Once those calculations are taken into account, you can see the per pupil rate in the farthest column. This slide similarly shows those amounts for fiscal year 25. Moving to the fourth tier of funding in the pupil-centered funding plan, this would be similar to the enhancement component of the state's budget build process and add supplemental funding for specific categories. Currently, as I mentioned, there are 3 categories of students identified for weighted funding, and these include at-risk, English language learners, and gifted and talented students. These students are identified to receive additional supports beyond the base funding to augment their learning. This funding is calculated based on a weight, as you can see identified on this slide, also known as a multiplier, and is associated with a specific category of need and is applied to the statewide base per pupil amount to determine a total amount of funding. This amount is then multiplied by the number of students identified in the category as of October 1st of the prior year. And as I was mentioning, these are the counts that were estimated on calculated on October 1st for fiscal year 24. We currently do not have estimated counts for fiscal year 25, but once those counts are received on October 1st of 2023, they will be used to update the calculations in the next year, the biennium. I do want to note that pursuant to NRS 387.1214, if a student is identified in more than one category, for the purposes of allocating funding, the student is only identified in the highest weighted category. And this means that if a student is identified as an English learner and at risk, who is at risk of not graduating with their cohort, their count is only reflected in the English learner count for the pupil-centered funding plan. When we talk about these counts, we refer to them as unduplicated, so that way we have clear cutoffs of where the funding is then allocated to. Taking a little bit closer look at the at-risk category of students, we do get a lot of questions on this, and so we wanted to provide some information in terms of this definition. The State Board of Education did adopt an alternative method as allowed under statute. With their recent adoption, the definition is now considered students who are at risk of not graduating with their cohort. Currently, the department is working with a vendor who identifies and works through 5 different areas of concern with a total of 75 different factors that are utilized to determine a student's progress. Not one component within this calculation is weighted so high that it alone can significantly move a student along the indicator. And it's a holistic approach at evaluating a student's need for additional supports to ensure that they are able to graduate with their peers. In terms of what that means in terms of the number of students served, looking back previously at the categorical funding that was identified for students in similar definitions of at-risk, we have new Nevada Plan students in Victory. One thing to keep in mind with these counts is they are duplicated, and so the counts that are listed on this slide could have students who were identified in other areas because the information at the time that these were calculated was not available. And so looking at these, you can see we have approximately 79,000 students who are served through New Nevada and Victory. When we use the free and reduced price lunch eligibility definition, we were looking at serving 273,000 students. With the at-risk definition that was adopted by the State Board of Education, we are looking at serving 63,000 students, and this thereby increases the per pupil amount available to serve those students. With that in mind, this slide shows you the fiscal year 24 recommended funding based on the counts and the per pupil weights that we addressed in the previous 2 slides. Similarly, this slide shows the recommended funding amounts for fiscal year '25. Please keep in mind, again, these will be recalculated in the second year of the biennium once the October 1 counts are received from fiscal year '23. Finally, moving to the total phase of the calculation for the pupil-centered funding plan, this slide shows the fiscal year '24 amounts for each one of those categories or tiers that we had addressed in the earlier slides. I do want to pause and make note here. You'll see that if you look back and compare this to the amounts that were identified in previous slides, these are the amounts that have been adjusted for the fiscal year '20 baseline mechanism, and so they are slightly lower than the original calculations as a result of that mechanism. And similarly, fiscal year '25, and as we noted, total funding is $5.5 billion compared to $5.3 billion in fiscal year '24. Simplifying that a little bit more and moving it to a per pupil rate, this slide shows you the fiscal year '24 total funding identified divided by the projected enrollment to give you the per pupil amount for each LEA. And similarly, this slide shows you the same information for fiscal year '25. And with that, that concludes our presentation for the budget account 2609, and I'd like to pause for any questions that the committee may have.
Thank you so much for that. And we will go ahead and start with Senator Dondero Loop.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So one of the questions that I would like is I'd like a little bit more information on the factors that were considered as the governor determined that pupil-centered funding plan and receiving the same level of general fund appropriations in the 23-25 biennium as approved by the legislature in the last session. And just on cue, thank you very much.
I couldn't yell from the back row and say I'm here, but thank you so much. For the record, my name is Amy Stevenson. I'm the director of the Governor's Finance Office. So in answer to your question, Senator Dondero Loop, with a significant increase in the funding for K-12 education through the dedicated revenue streams, the Lombardo administration felt it was the opportunity to utilize general fund to support other critical key functions of state government like mental health, Medicaid, state employees, and public safety. I would like to point out that the K-12 education funding fully funds weights for the English learners, at-risk and gifted and talented, and increase the per pupil amount.
And before you leave, can you also give us a little bit more information on the overview of the governor's recommendations for proposed legislation to improve the method by which the funding for public schools is determined?
Yes, for the record, my name is Amy Stevenson, Director for Governor's Finance Office. So we have submitted a budget bill request that is driven by the fact that the current statutory, the way it's made up currently, requires increase in education spending to the potential detriment of other essential services. And the Lombardo administration believes that we have funding responsibilities across all program areas that are worthy of funding. I believe the budget BDR, instead of uses the word increased, says adjusted, and it's the lesser of the two instead of the higher of the two. Did that answer your question, ma'am?
So what was the change out of the word? You said it included increase instead of...
the word adjusted instead of increased.
Oh, adjusted? Mm-hmm. I won't ask you to define those. Thank you very much.
Ms. Stevenson, you may need to be up here for my question, but I'm not sure unless Department of Education wants to respond. But please provide an update on the state's efforts to review and validate the net proceeds of minerals revenue for school districts that was received in fiscal year 2022, which must be transferred to the school districts in fiscal year 2023 to comply with the provisions of the Nevada Constitution and also NRS 387.195.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. For the record, Amy Stevenson with the Governor's Finance Office. We're actually having a meeting right after this hearing to figure that all out because I need to figure out that impact as well. So to be determined.
That would be great if you could get that information back to our fiscal staff. We would greatly appreciate that. Thank you so much. Next, we will go on to Assemblywoman Peters.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple of questions regarding the 15% cap on the education stabilization account, if I may. My first question is, why is the balance forward of funding that would exceed the 15% cap on the education stabilization account not reflected as the beginning balance in the pupil-centered funding plan budget for the FY24 cycle?
Megan Peterson for the record. At this time, because fiscal year 23 has not closed out yet, the amount has not been identified and so is not available for consideration.
Madam Chair, thank you so much. So do we expect legislation to be submitted proposing an increase to the 15% cap?
Megan Peterson for the record. No legislation is currently being considered to my knowledge.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Oh, I'm sorry. I have one more question, but it's on a different issue area, if I may.
Go ahead.
Could you explain to us why the education stabilization account isn't reflective in the executive budget, please?
Yes, ma'am. Amy Stevenson, Governor's Finance Office Director. So the reason that the education stabilization account was being excluded is there is no expenditures coming out of this account. It is treated very much like our rainy day account, and that's why it's not in the budget.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Next, we have a question from Assemblywoman Kasama.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of my questions, I'm not quite sure who can answer those. It's more just kind of understanding some of the formula and clarification on that. So under the Tier 1 services, I was looking at your slide, the auxiliary services, and you may have mentioned this, why Clark, Douglas, and Washoe don't have any food services calculations in that amount.
Megan Peterson for the record. In the case of those school districts and in some other areas, they actually are essentially self-funded through the services that they offer within their district, and so they don't have expenditures reported as a result.
So the food service in those counties are not supported by state appropriation. It's from the fees that are charged to the students or from the local counties?
James Kirkpatrick for the record. Much of the food services for some of the several larger districts, their funding comes from earned interest, federal grant programs, other revenues outside of general fund transfers, which the pupil-centered funding plan tries to cover the districts where the general fund was impact for food services, so that would be the difference.
Great, thank you. May I continue with another question?
Is it on the same one?
No. Okay, on the Tier 4 weighted funding, there seems like substantial increase in the numbers between fiscal year 23 and when you go to 24 and 25. There's quite an increase from that, and I'm just wondering what has caused that, the weighted funding for the at-risk English language gifted and talented by year. It's slide 27. if that helps.
Megan Peterson for the record. Could you restate the question? I think you were asking about.
So, for example, in fiscal year 23, if you look at the at-risk, the funding per pupil is
Okay.
$244, and then suddenly in fiscal year 24, it's $2,584. And each three category, it substantially jumps up in 24 and a little bit in 25. Just wondering, what is the big jump?
Megan Peterson for the record. That is actually a direct result of the increase in funding that was recommended as part of the governor's executive budget. And because of the increase in the choice to fully fund the weights, that is the result.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I have one more question, but I'll wait if there's time.
So much.
And I'm going to turn your direction back to the pupil center funding plan. I had a quick question when looking at the money coming in and money going out. There could be a time, because obviously the funding formula is based on the revenue. And so I had a quick question. What is the plan in case the revenue doesn't come in as expected, and obviously bills are due? Could kind of deal with that cash flow issue that may arise during the fiscal years. I understand for the first fiscal year that basically there could be money from the second year to cover that, but kind of more curious about that second year of fiscal year 25.
Megan Peterson for the record. Obviously, it depends on what point in the fiscal year or the biennium we are in. If we are in the first year, we have the ability to borrow from the next fiscal year. If we are in the second year of the biennium, if there are reserves available, we can draw from those. But otherwise, the current mechanism would be similar to those in years past, where we would request a supplemental appropriation from the legislature.
And this may be where you're going, but what oversight would the IFC have in the possible use of funding from the education stabilization account for cash flow purposes, given the account is not included in the executive budget?
Megan Peterson for the record. Currently, as statute is written, there is no mechanism for us to access those funds, even if presented before IFC. The funds within the stabilization account, as mentioned earlier, have the 15% transfer, and that is the only mechanism available through the fund right now.
And I think you guys said earlier in response to one of my colleagues that there's no BDR in place to address that 15% at this time. So with that, we'll go ahead and move to Senator Canizero.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I've got a couple of questions, if that's okay. So we've talked a little bit about the statewide base for 24 is 8,596, and then for 25 in the recommended budget is 9,023, which is an increase over fiscal year 23. And as we all understand, having been here, and this is how we're sort of seeing the pupil-centered funding plan come to fruition, it's a revenue-based plan, so it's driven by those projected revenues instead of by expenditures. Can you talk to us a little bit about the Commission on School Funding? When you were talking, I know you touched on this a bit during the presentation, about the optimal funding levels, which was one of the subject matters of Assembly Bill 495 from the 2021 session. Can you talk to us just about the Commission's work on providing that optimal funding? And I think as we understand it, over 10 years, they were recommending about 2.785 billion to reach that national average. And so can you just talk a little bit about that and how you've taken a look at that or worked to calculate that in your projections?
Thank you, Senator Canizero, for the question. For the record, Joan Ebert, State Superintendent of Public Instruction. So the Commission did submit a report as required by November 14th. Since that time, we have had additional data and then also to the governor's recommended budget. And when you take all of those pieces into consideration, the Commission on School Funding reported out to get to optimal funding by 2023 would be an additional $2.8 billion. Given the governor's proposed budget at this moment in time, that the same timeline of 2033, it would be $2.1 billion. And so we have additional slides and information that we can provide the committee if the chair so wishes, but that's a high-level overview for the national average.
And thank you for that, Superintendent and Madam Chair. I think if the committee was willing to take a look at that additional information, that would probably be helpful, but I'll leave that to the chair's discretion to ask for that information. I want to talk about a couple of other things. So the budget also reflects, as I understand it, there's a calculated four-year average for food and transportation costs from 2019 to 2022. That is also recommended to be provided back to the school districts in each year of the 2023 to 25 biennium. And we didn't see any changes to those costs for any grant funding through the Department of Education for hold harmless or inflationary adjustment factors for transportation, or recommendations or any plans for transportation for university schools for profoundly gifted students or for charter schools. So have you received any of those types of plans? Have you followed up to account for those? Why aren't they reflected in the budget? And if so, how much? And if you have, then I guess why aren't those plans accounted for in the budget? And if so, how much would be the estimated annual cost to establish such a grant program for those services?
Thank you for the question, Senator Canizar. For the record, State Superintendent Joan Ebert. The commission, let me back because you long set of questions there and statements. The commission backing up looking at transportation for the profoundly gifted at the university school as well as charter schools. In the Commission on School Funding report, there is a recommendation to look at that funding. When this budget was proposed by the governor, it was not included. Have we been asked to look at what it would cost over time? The commission did that work, and we have been asked to look at what it would cost to add to fund those pieces. We don't have because depending on what mechanism is determined, if you use a school district's current, if it was Clark County we were looking at and we used what Clark County uses for buses and consider those schools would be different than looking at what is currently provided by some charter schools. So depending on what mechanism is determined would drive the dollar amount. So I don't have a dollar amount for you because it would depend on what methodology is determined.
And thank you for that. And so as I understand it, you haven't received any plans, what that mechanism looks like, any further details about any of that. So it's hard to, as I'm understanding it, hard to build that into a budget when it's just being asked to sort of be looked at.
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, different models, depending on what is determined, that would be what's implemented.
Great. And then I have one final question, Madam Chair, and this pertains to the funding for support for pupils with disabilities, which, as I understand it, we sort of get those amounts here in the budget that are recommended to be provided back to each school district and charter school for each year of the biennium based upon the actual local revenue provided by each school district and charter schools in FY 2022. It looks like in the executive budget, there are two school districts, Elko and Lincoln County, that are projected to receive none of that funding based on reporting no transfers from the general funds to their special education funds. So can you can you talk to us about what efforts are currently being made by the Department of Education to review and validate those reports pursuant to NRS 387-303, and whether there's any additional information you can provide, especially regarding those two school districts?
Megan Peterson for the record. The two school districts that you're specifically referencing, we have been in contact, and actually we've been in contact with all charter schools and school districts, and it's part of the ongoing process once we receive those reports to review and validate the information. And in conversation with those two school districts, and with the changes and updates to the 387 reporting as a result of the People-Centered Funding Plan, the local special education specifically was identified to be incorrectly reported. We are working with those school districts and, as I mentioned, the other school districts and charter schools to make updates to auxiliary services, food services, and transportation, as well as the local special education. We are wrapping up those activities, but we do still have a few rounds of validation to go as we work through that.
Great, thank you, and thank you, Madam Chair.
And thank you. And I just want to echo Senator Canizaro's request with respect to the additional information that the Nevada Department of Education had considered. Do you guys mind getting that information over to our fiscal staff? That'd be greatly appreciated. So then we can all get it as well. Next, we'll move on to Assemblywoman Peters.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question related to enrollment trends. Can you detail any enrollment trends the department has identified in statewide enrollment, including where pupils have migrated, such as to charter or private schools, since the COVID-19 pandemic?
Megan Peterson for the record. Enrollment trends over the last few years have been sporadic at best. Overall, the state experienced a downward trend that brought us back in alignment with somewhere around 2016 enrollment counts. Prior to the start of the pandemic, we did see overall enrollment was increasing, but with a move also supported from school districts moving to charter schools. That trend has continued to some extent through the pandemic, even with the decreasing enrollment overall. It is difficult to say with the general decrease in enrollment whether they went to private schools or other options or moved out of state, but we do still somewhat continue to see the trend of students moving from school districts to charter schools. Compared to last school year, enrollment seems to be coming in relatively flat, but we will certainly be looking to our third quarter reports to help validate that. In terms of that, the trends that we had seen within the quarterly reporting prior to the start of the pandemic, those trends have not held. And so we are still learning and seeing what trends are to continue to play out.
May I ask a follow-up? And this is my naivete. When we're talking about like the online options, I assume some of those are private online options, but I know that there are some state-sponsored. Are those included in the charter school numbers, or is that a separate category? I didn't see it on your slide looking at enrollment, so wondering where those folks are captured.
Megan Peterson for the record. If the online school is a state or a public school, the counts are reflected within the individual charter school, or when we calculate at the school district level, they are calculated within the school district enrollment. So I believe we have two online charter schools, Nevada Connections Academy specifically. They are rolled up into the line that's identified as charter, but if you would like to see, we do have the charter schools broken out separately within the funding model.
Madam Chair, I have one follow-up question. I'm sorry, on this particular issue. So I know a couple of years ago we were talking about that the Clark County and Washoe County had really not sponsored any additional charter schools. Have we seen a change in that, or is that pretty standard now that our counties are just going with who they have, and that most of the charter schools we're seeing stood up are under the charter school authority?
Thank you for the question, Superintendent Ebert, for the record. So the school districts that currently have charter schools have not added any additional charter schools. What we do see is entities applying to have charter schools, and so the city of Las Vegas actually applied to the charter school authority, and now they have a charter school. So the process of going through the charter school authority is still in place, and that's where we see the additions of charter schools.
Thank you so much. And next we'll move to Assemblyman Yeager.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I have a few questions on the Nevada Cost of Education Index. And the first one was just if you could talk a little bit about the factors and calculations that were used to develop the Cost of Education Index that appears in the materials we received.
James Kirkpatrick for the record. The Nevada Cost of Education Index is developed using two components. One is a goods component and the other is a wage component. The two components are then combined, and then they are weighted based on the statewide school district expenditures divided by goods and salaries.
And Madam Chair, if I could ask a follow-up. So the calculations we have in front of us, I understand were prepared when the executive budget was prepared, which seems like a long time ago, but I guess it really wasn't that long ago in the world we live in. But I just wondered if there's any updated information that you would be able to use to recalculate to get a more accurate number, or do you think the numbers in front of us are as accurate as we're going to get right now?
James Kirkpatrick for the record. The NCEI data elements that build up the index were updated using federal information as of January 22nd. New data, as I understand, new federal data will be available or should be available now if for another update if required.
Thank you. And then if I could just transition, still in the same general topic area, but I'm wondering if someone could speak to the Commission on School Funding had recommended eliminating the Nevada Cost of Education Index, and obviously that's not what is being proposed here, at least not entirely. And I just wondered if someone could elaborate on the Commission's justification for recommending that we eliminate the Nevada Cost of Education Index.
James Kirkpatrick for the record. I believe the commission in September of 22 recommended to adjust the index at 1.0 to nullify the effect, not to eliminate the adjustment in the event that down the road better source data could be found to reinstate the index.
Yeah, and thank you for that clarification. I don't think they stated that well, but yes, essentially to put everyone at a factor of 1, so there would essentially be no adjustment, but I understand the point of maybe we would reevaluate that in the future. But that does lead to, I think, my final question on this topic. So not everyone is at a factor of 1 here. In the index that we have in front of us, Clark is over 1, and then there are 3 or 4 districts, maybe more, who would have been underneath the factor of 1, but they've all been raised to 1. So I just wondered, given the Commission on School Funding's recommendation that everyone be held at 1, what was the justification for having the factor at 1 for every school district other than Clark, who has a little bit of an adjustment upward?
James Kirkpatrick for the record. In August of 2021, the commission had recommended to use the raw NCI data, which would include the positive gains as well as the negative gains. The agency requested budget was built on that recommendation. The recommendation of the commission to set everybody at 1 came after the submission of the agency requested budget. And I believe the governor's recommended budget actually reflects the same NCI adjustment that was used or was approved during the 81st legislative session, which was to set a floor of 1.0.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll move to Senator Neal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I had a question, I guess, to Ms. Stevenson, or it could be either one, on the inflationary measure. So I'm trying to get clear on, it's my understanding, I guess, the governor is recommending an increase of 4.52 for the CPI. And so what I'm trying to understand, because this has worried me since it's been in the bill, that the inflation that we're currently having is not a predictor for the future, right? It's not a predictor for 25, 26, 27. And so when you start to, I think, artificially apply a number, you're going to run into trouble because that revenue is not going to meet that inflationary measure that you have statutorily or arbitrarily decided is appropriate for the season. And so I need you to explain to me what is really happening around this inflation conversation within the governor's office, because I'm not clear on what I guess is the decision point that's being had, and I want some additional information.
Megan Peterson, for the record. The inflationary adjustment is prescribed within statute and so is applied based on the requirements within that provision, keeping in mind and recognizing obviously that the CPI that was used is backwards looking. It's important to keep in mind that their inflation looking forward is very fickle. As we know and can experience, even a projection can be wrong. And so projecting a higher than anticipated inflation could have alternative impacts that wouldn't have been contemplated. So in alignment with other practices, we use a point in time from a most recent reference as a result.
Can I have a follow-up? So based on what you just said, and excusing the last part of your sentence, is the governor increasing the inflation amount? I understand what the statute says. I'm clear on that. The question that I'm asking, is there an addition to, is there an arbitrary add-on inflationary number that is being brought into play? That's what I'm asking.
Megan Peterson, for the record, there is no additional adjustment beyond the CPI that's being included.
So what's the number that is currently the inflationary number that is in play right now?
James Kirkpatrick, for the record. I believe the CPI calculation equated to about 4.52%, and that was an adjustment to the statewide base, and I could be off a couple of dollars. Okay, I can follow up on the exact amount based on that. It's built within the model. I can look that up and get it back to you. The dollar increase to the statewide base.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much. We'll go to Senator Titus.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question, and thank you for all of you in the room today looking at educating our kids to the best of our state's ability. I'd like to go back to page 15 on your presentation on the enrollment and projected number of students, and the numbers that you see projected from 2024 to 2025. I have significant concerns that those may not be as accurate as they could be based on what I know. I represent 6 different rural counties, and having met with most of those superintendents in those rural areas, especially in particular Douglas County, they've had steady loss of enrollment over the last several years, and I'm concerned about that, and I'm wondering if you have any of the data, because you lump kind of charter schools combined, 64,000. We know they're going up. Do you have any breakdown of where those students are coming from? Are there 60,000 kids in Clark County in charter schools versus the rural? Does any of that break out into any kind of chart? And if so, could you share that with us?
Megan Peterson for the record. The way that the information is gathered, we don't necessarily have visibility to whether a student moved from one school district to another or from out of state, but what we do have are what is actually being observed within the district. And so it is part of the budget building process, as I mentioned, that once the April 1st third quarter enrollment counts are received, that we will revise these numbers to try to account for any changes so that it is as accurate as possible.
So we don't know on the charter school students what counties they reside in?
Megan Peterson for the record. We do know which county the students reside for each charter school. As the information was required previously to be collected, we have the district of resident identified, which is what we still collect today.
So you could share that with us? So we would know what counties are losing students to the charter schools?
Megan Peterson for the record. We can provide the information. It doesn't necessarily reflect that a student moved from a school district to a charter school because the student could have come from out of state or from a homeschool or other institution. It just identifies where the student currently resides within either a charter school or school district.
One more question, Madam Chair. Along the same thing, looking at for the rural areas and the numbers, when we talk about inflation, and my colleague to my left brought up the cost of living and all of those kind of numbers, I'm wondering how that is. I know what you use. I think a goods component and wage component is one thing on some of these factors, and wondering if the cost of living doesn't include, for example, again, using Douglas County, and how much it costs to live in Douglas County, rent, housing, certainly South Lake Tahoe, very expensive areas, and they certainly would have an impact for teachers to be able to reside there. And I'm just wondering if any of that is taken into consideration more than just, certainly even the price of gas costs more when you drive through Highway 50 corridor down to Las Vegas. You'll know some of these rural communities, the price of gas is quite large. And just, I'm not seeing that reflected in this. And it's just kind of in my mind, a two-dimensional numbers that you're using. It doesn't really reflect what it costs to live in any certain areas.
Megan Peterson for the record. To the first question regarding housing, as we mentioned, the housing was contemplated by the subject matter experts when they did the work with other states. And what they found was that by including the cost of housing, it unnecessarily shifts the funding to those more affluent neighborhoods. And it's not necessarily a reflection of the cost to attract a person to a certain area. And again, that goes back to the idea that there may be a higher cost of living. However, because you have more access and greater access to healthcare or those things that are essential to some, that it costs less to attract them and to employ them then. In terms of including other costs such as gasoline, there is a cost of goods component that is based on regional price parities, and certain components of those, like you mentioned, are contemplated there.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for the questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll move to Vice Chair Dondero Loop.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So I need a little bit of clarification. So can you tell me why the executive budget reflects providing online school district schools with the adjusted base per pupil amount, despite the Commission on School Funding recommending that these pupils be funded at the statewide base per pupil?
James Kirkpatrick for the record. I will need to follow up on that.
All right, thank you. And then following up on that, Madam Chair, earlier when the question was asked about online schools and how they were counted, I believe I heard that there were 2 online charters, and I was confused about the amount.
Megan Peterson for the record. When you say amount, are you referring to the number of online?
I believe one of my colleagues asked how many online charters there were, and I believe you answered 2.
Off the top of my head, I can think of 2, but we can go back and confirm the actual count.
Okay, and are you saying online 2 as in state charters versus county charters, or are you saying 2 as in companies versus the name of the charter?
Megan Peterson for the record. When I was discussing the online school, I was referring to the charter schools specifically that are fully online, and that would include Nevada Connections Academy and Nevada Virtual. I was not including those schools that may be offered through the school district.
Okay, so you wouldn't include Odyssey, you wouldn't include Nevada State High School, you wouldn't include K through 12, I can't remember the name of it, the whole name of it. So you're not including all of those?
Megan Peterson for the record. For the purposes of the discussion, I simplified it, but I can get the final count for you once we get back
That would be great. Thank you very much. And that will help us with my question about why that information, why that subject was moved to a different funding source from what the School Funding Commission, suggested. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Next, we'll move to Assemblyman Miller.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone. I have a couple of questions here regarding the at-risk determination factors. I'm curious to know, when I'm looking at my notes here and I see that we have I guess like a 75% decrease in the number of students identified as at risk, and I understand that a lot of that has to do with the redetermination of the funding formula based on the students who are at Title I schools or receiving free and reduced lunch that were actually not at-risk students. But when I look at this difference, it's almost 180,000 students from 23 to 24. I wonder if we are missing a significant number of students in the new formula that has been, determined. So I'm curious if you can please elaborate on the various factors and measures that were used to identify at-risk pupils in the Infinite Campus system.
Megan Peterson for the record. I will refer back to slide 29, which identifies the 5 major categories, which include academic performance, attendance, behavior, home enrollment stability, and other. And within these categories, they also evaluate a student's average grade point, GPA, for example, or their grades over certain portions, such as grades that are between 70% and 80%. They also contemplate their assessment performance within certain percentiles. In terms of attendance, obviously being present versus the number of days that they're absent in a year. Looking at home and enrollment stability, how many times has a student changed schools, in addition to how many times have they moved within a school year. It also contemplates their grade level, whether they've had a change in guardianship. They also, the indicators also contemplate where the student's living, their gender, IEP status. There are a variety, like I said, 75 different indicators that are contemplated as part of evaluating a student's performance compared to their peers and whether they are on target to graduate with their peers.
May I add, thank you, Superintendent Ebert, for the record. I think when you look at slide 30, there's a few moving parts, and I think it adds to the question that we get quite often. I want to separate this into three different pieces, because we as a state have recognized those that have the steepest climb to be able to be successful in the classroom. In the last biennium, or excuse me, in the 19 session, there were two pieces, the new Nevada plan as well as Victory Schools. And each of those, the allocation of funds that were made available for the new Nevada plan, there were specific schools that were identified and had specific categories that they needed to meet. Specifically English language learners, bottom 25th percentile for assessment proficiency, and other pieces. But there was no overlap in funds as well. Then we had Victory Schools, and what happened in the transition when we went to the pupil-centered funding plan is there was a lot of discussion around at-risk. What does at-risk mean? And so at the time, we were asked to use free and reduced lunch. And that was prior to the pandemic. And also, too, other opportunities that school districts have taken advantage of with the community eligibility program. It's called CEP. So an entire school district now can be made up of free and reduced lunch students identified. So we have Churchill County School District right now, 100% of their students are identified in this number of 273,000. But the fact of the matter is, we know not every single child, 100% of Churchill County school districts are in need and are not on track to graduate. Some are flourishing, doing great work, ready to go to Ivy League schools and other opportunities that they have. So what we're doing is we're really narrowing in on those students that have the greatest need. We know that based on the factors that Deputy Superintendent Peterson was sharing, years of research that shows that these students identified are most likely they will not earn a diploma. We have about 20% of our students that I stay awake of every night of they're not earning a diploma. And so we're using these metrics that we know contribute to a student not graduating and identifying 63,000 students here. Now, with that, I would just add two other pieces. It says 63,000. There are actually about 90,000 students that are identified. But as we explained during the presentation, if you're identified as an ELL student, which is at a 0.5, so you're already receiving $4,700 additional as a student, and you're at risk, you fit both of those categories, you just receive the highest weight. So you receive that 4,700 instead of the 2,700. Two, when you're looking at this chart, because the recommended budget is proposing fully funding at risk, that $243, if we wanted to apples and apples it would be a different number, but that was prior to, thank you. We'll skip that. Anyway, so I will pause there, and I hope that helps answer the question.
Thank you. Yes, that helps a bit. So just based on what you were saying, that there are essentially another 30,000 students that would have qualified as at risk, but would now qualify as English learner, right?
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, they fit two categories.
And then they would get the heaviest
highest
weight. So when I look at this, I only see, at the numbers that I have, I only see about 1,000 student difference in the English learner category. So that still concerns me that there's a large number of students that may not be getting the funding or might not be calculated properly into the funding formula. With that being said, if we can provide, I know you provided the page in the slides that have like all of the factors that are considered. If we can maybe get some understanding on how those things are measured. Because even if someone is in, say, a Title I school, there may be other factors, and I did see like home and things like that as listed as reasons. But I'm curious to know if we have an idea or an understanding that you all can provide of how those factors are measured. And then one last question. How was it determined, absolutely determined, that that only those that identified as at-risk pupils in the bottom 20th percentile of at-risk students would be receiving this funding? And I know you mentioned those with the greatest need, right? But if we can identify any student at-risk funding, they probably are at greatest need for a multitude of different reasons. So I'm just curious to know how we got there, because I still feel like there is a significant number of students that may be missed.
Thank you for the question, Superintendent Ebert, for the record. Those determinations, as far as at risk, looking at the percentage of students that graduate, because there is, as you noted, a great variation in across our state and students. So when you look at our graduation rate, we have 82% currently graduating with their cohort. And so at this point in time, we looked at the 20th percentile, those that most likely, and it is also to starting in elementary school. It's not just, some people think we're just looking at the ones graduating, but it is elementary through 12th grade. The lifting of the base and those other resources we see as an opportunity for the school districts to drive dollars to the students that are in need. So it's how the entire formula runs, with the base being what it is to be able to provide resources for students, and then the additional weights, and that is how it's been determined at this point in time.
Can you, just one last question, can you help, from my mind, help me understand how long someone qualifies for a particular weight? So if they are determined in the 3rd grade to be at risk, does it stay with them through their entire school career? Or if they're determined at 6th grade to be an English learner, how long does the funding stay with them? Is it throughout their career or for a few years?
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, Assemblyman, that is an amazing question. So we have several different mechanisms. We use assessments for our ELL students. They are assessed annually. Our goal is to make sure that they are provided these resources. And again, we're very pleased that the recommendation is to fully fund the weights, because all of our research has shown that when we fund and provide those resources, the students will achieve. So if I am a 3rd grader today, I'm ELL, I will be assessed. I may actually exit out of those services because I have been provided the supports in a timely manner. I now am biliterate, and so I would no longer be receiving those funds. For the at-risk, so that's an annual piece, and then same thing for at-risk. It is identified once a year through all of these methodologies, because we don't have the technology to do it on a daily basis, but all of those funds are identified once a year. All of those students are identified once a year for those funds.
Thank you. Thank you for the time, Chair.
Great. We'll move to Assemblyman Yeager.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And I just had a couple follow-up questions on this topic. I was looking at slide 28, where we had the student counts, and we have at-risk, English learner, and gifted and talented broken out. I understand that the student gets the highest weight. I just wondered, are the at-risk and English learners separated in this graph? For instance, the numbers that I see for English learners, those have been pulled out of the at-risk category?
Thank you for the question. Superintendent Eber, for the record, yes, those students are pulled out.
Great, thanks. And then my next question, you did a pretty good job explaining the factors for at-risk, and I appreciate the slide 29 that has really a wealth of factors. And looking at some of those, some of those I think would factor into potentially English language learner, for instance, refugee status, birth country, Hispanic identity, home primary language. So my question is kind of, can you tell me about the interplay between English learner students and at-risk? Like, it would seem to me naturally that if you're learning English, you're probably at risk, but can you give me a sense of what that correlation there is, if there's a number? Like, is there a certain percentage of English learners under this model that qualify at risk, or am I totally off base on that? Are those two separate issues?
Thank you for the question, Superintendent Eber, for the record. So no, I could be, as a student, identified in two categories. I can be at risk, I can be an English language learner based on these metrics. We currently fund at the highest weight. So you started to get into, with your question, some research behind, to what degree an English learner needs additional supports. And it's a great question, because individuals are exactly that, individuals. There are a lot of components that come into it, but I will tell you, our educators in the classroom, when they are working with our students, and they have the information they need, they have the resources they need, they identify to what level the student needs support. So I may be an English language learner, and it really is about language, but I may also have some other components here where I also need the supports of a guidance counselor to work with myself. So those are the types of interplay, education being a very complex work that we do. So I very much appreciate the question, and it hopefully that helped.
Yeah, thank you. Could I ask just maybe one more, Madam Chair? And I'm sorry, I think I asked a bit of a rambling question. I apologize for that, and I appreciate the answer. But I guess what I'm really trying to get at is, would you be able to break out on the student counts chart on page 28 how many of the English learners would also qualify for the at-risk? I was just trying to get a kind of a quantitative analysis of how many fit both of those categories. And I know you might not have that now, but just wondering if you could get
Superintendent Eber,
that.
for the record, yes.
Okay, thanks. And then, Madam Chair, I promise this is my last one, if you'll allow it. So, obviously in the at-risk discussion, it looks like in the prior biennium, we funded that weight at 0.03. And now with the governor's recommended budgets, that's at 0.3, which is a full funding of the weight under the school commission. Obviously, not lost in that is we eliminated about 75% of the folks who were previously at risk in the new definition of at risk in terms of at least the number, right? I think we went from approximately 240,000, which I understand were free and reduced lunch. That was the metric. But with the new metric, we're really lowering the number of students. And so my question was, and again, you may not have this now, if we had kept the prior definition of free and reduced lunch, what would that weight be funded at given the governor's proposed budget? I'm assuming it wouldn't be fully funded at 0.3, but I'm just curious if we're talking about halfway to fully funding. Does the question make sense?
Superintendent Eber, for the record, I would need to go back to find that piece. What I would add to the conversation is that at-risk definition was inflated because there are children that are not at risk. And Jason Gowdy, who's the CFO in the Clark County School District, testified many times that his child would be is identified to receive some of these funds. But his child is not at risk of graduating in any way, shape, or form, and it needs additional resources. So what happened is it was inflated by the past definition of truly, is that a child in need?
Let's move back to Assemblywoman Kasama.
Thank you so much, Chair, for your indulgence with one more question. kind of along the same line, I'm looking at slide 30, where you have the free and reduced lunch, and we have the students there at 273,828. So for clarification, that number there, because during COVID, we provided free lunch to everybody, and then we also had families that were truly at risk. We were not requiring them to complete the forms so that we would get federal funding returned to our states. So we lost that, and then we can't identify the numbers. So I'm asking, this number, did it include all of the free and reduced lunch number, even, or did you do any adjustment for those that might have qualified for the federal funding?
James Kirkpatrick for the record. The 200,000 that you've identified.
273,000.
Thank you. Those are the people identified under the federal definition of FRL. So under the federal definition, if 40% of a school population is eligible under the federal guidelines for free and reduced lunch, the entire school receives the free FRL designation. That number includes those students.
So we couldn't track which students qualified for the federal reimbursement, so this number would be inflated? Is that correct for this calculation for this year?
James Kirkpatrick for the record. I would have to confirm that, but that might be the case, but I definitely would have to confirm it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. One other thing I wanted to see if you guys could provide, I believe Assemblyman Miller had asked if there's a way to share with us how the weights are measured, like the different categories that are taken into consideration to determine the at-risk students. And I'm not sure if it's like a computer formula, but how those, like if there's weights applied to each, like whether someone wasn't born in the U.S., those kind of thing. If you have that available, if you could share that with us as well, that'd be greatly appreciated. Next, I'll go to Assemblywoman Monroe Moreno.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a few questions, but a number of them have already been asked, but I do have two specifically, if that's okay. Thank you. On slide number 29, there's a list of factors for at-risk, and throughout your presentation, you referred to that these were things that were adopted by the State Board of Education, that the State Board of Education determined what these factors were, or was there a group or an organization that went to the State Board of Education to make a presentation to get them to make this new adoption for the new definition of what we have for at-risk students?
Megan Peterson for the record. The State Board of Education heard presentations from the vendor that currently provides this information, which is Infinite Campus, and they did come and present on the factors that they have been working to develop to create this grad score indicator. And so these were a determination by the vendor based on over 10 years of data.
Follow up, Madam Chair? And with Infinite Campus, I believe is what you said, can you share with us how they break everything down other than a little bit more than what's on here? Can you share that with the committee? And then also with the change in how we're now calculating at-risk students, how is that going to affect the individual schools?
Megan Peterson for the record. We can get that information for you from the vendor. In terms of what the at-risk funding means for each school, similar to the weighted funding provided for the other categories, those funds are intended to follow the student. And so for each of the students who are identified, the school will receive the funding associated with those students.
So perhaps I didn't word it correctly. So schools have a student population, and they were getting funded, and some of those students got at-risk funding that will now not be getting at-risk funding because they won't meet what the new definition is, although in my opinion, those students are still at risk. How is that going to financially impact the individual schools and what those educators can, tools that they have to help those students in those schools?
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, the dollars flow from the State Department of Education to the school district, and individual schools sometimes receive those dollars, as Deputy Superintendent Peterson was stating. Also, too, though, especially with our rural schools, when you have a dispersed population of whether it's ELL, at-risk special ed, the school districts maintain that money at the district level, so they can usually human capital hire someone, then one person that can travel to each school. So I guess through all this conversation, we as a department need to be clear that the dollars go directly to the school district, and then the services at the district level and the dollars are distributed at the district level, not from the department directly to individual schools.
So then it would have a direct impact on the service level that the district's able to provide to those schools if the school now has a lower number of at-risk students with the new calculation.
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, thank you for the question, and I think this is where we have a divergence of what at-risk means, because I go back to several colleagues that share that they are identified their children are identified currently in this 273,000 number, but their children are not at risk.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll go to Senator Neal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I have a couple of questions, but I want to go back to a statement that Assemblyman Miller asked about whether or not the designation follows the student ELL or at-risk as they move through. And I want to talk a little bit about the ELL assessment, which my understanding is WIDA, right? And I've seen the WIDA assessment that's given to high school students. And I think the thing that bothered me the most about what it looked like is that it almost looked like a fifth grade level test on language. And I'm wondering, as we examine that assessment and determine whether or not it's appropriate, right, for testing literacy, because that was the first, I've had that question for years. I think we should look at it, and I want to know how we're dealing with the students that are coming in that are ELL that do not have an actual teacher who can speak to the language barrier, and what is the positioning around those kids who are literally peer tutoring themselves literally through 6th grade through 12th, right? And how we do that academic support and examine that. Because what I think we don't do in the labeling, which I've always had a problem with, is the deep dive on the service that's actually needed.
Thank you for the question, Senator Neal. Superintendent Ebert, for the record, you've hit the nail on the head in the education system in Nevada. I mean, we do not have the number of educators currently or the support staff in our state to meet every single piece of the system that we want to provide. So in some instances, school districts have brought in, peers to assist in a classroom. They also use technology. I believe that this budget going forward, if approved, will address those issues that we've had in the past. We're moving from, $1,600 $500 for an ELL student to $4,300 per student. And so those resources that you would provide potentially as a body, driving those to the classroom, we should see a different classroom than we see today.
Madam Chair, just a quick follow-up, and then I have a second question. I think the issue that I'm having is that we say that we drive the dollars to the classroom, but we don't examine what the performance is in the classroom for those students. And just because you give the money to a school district and say, hey, this is for ELL, this is for at-risk, please do that work, we already know that work is not happening. And so what I'm wondering, while we're having these budget conversations, how are we going to drive the dollars around a performance actual metric where we see the dollar serving the child? We've used this tagline, the dollar follows the kid, but that doesn't mean serve the child, right? And that is the issue, and that is the problem. And when this battle between at-risk and ELL is also a problem. We started out this conversation about what's equal and what's equity, but if you have more at-risk students, then that means the at-risk student is getting a lower amount of money to be served, in my mind. That's my opinion. So you could be at-risk and Black, you could be at-risk and Hawaiian, and that child is not being served at the same equal level. And so I don't understand why we just can't make it 0.50 for both and then move into an equal scenario, because those children historically are found in poverty. They're found in all of the neighborhoods that I represent. And I'm really tired of having a conversation and a battle, ideological battle over what is appropriate for a child that cannot read, a child that cannot perform mathematic equations, and saying that it's okay for them to be in a higher number but at a lower weight because we don't want to pay for them. And we don't want to dial in and say, how are you treating and performing and making sure that those students can actually be educated? Because one of the statements that you made was that there are 20% of the kids who won't graduate, period. So what are the characteristics of those children? Because in my mind, the characteristics of those children, if you were to lay it out, they would be Black and brown. They would be kids that I know go to my schools and have gone to Booker, have gone to Matt Kelly, have gone to Von Tobel, have gone to several schools that have historically had a problem. And I'm trying to figure out, when we talk about dollars, those 20% actually are getting dollars, but they actually do deserve to graduate and get a performance metric on why they're not moving the needle forward, because that is the historical lineage that is going on with our kids. And I've seen it. I've been in the school since 2007, and I've seen a student who literally in 3rd grade you knew couldn't read and is in 6th grade academically not performing, and they're in your metric. But we're not talking about it, and we're not tagging the school districts and saying, how dare you let this kid make it to 8th grade and they can't read? And that's what I don't want. I don't want to give a hot dime, right, until we make those school districts perform for those students. I don't care if it follows the kid. I want the performance and the work.
With that, you know, it brought something to my attention that I was thinking that we had discussed in the last presentation, and I don't know if you guys have this. Is there any way you guys have like some way to tell where these children, what schools will be impacted by these at-risk students, like maybe like, I don't know, like a map or something, like just to show us maybe so we can see where those dollars may end up with those students, if those dollars do follow the students? I think that would be really helpful for the committee. And then with that, we'll go ahead and close budget account 2032609 and open up budget account 1012619. And hopefully you guys can do a nice short and sweet presentation, and then we have some questions for you.
Megan Peterson, for the record. I can absolutely do that. For this presentation, we do only have one slide. There are 3 categories within Budget Account 2619 to provide funding for special education within the state. The first category, Category 19, the governor's recommended budget provides $233 million in fiscal year 24 and $237 million for fiscal year 25. This funding is identified to serve students who are identified with an IEP, Individual Education Plan, as of October 1st of the prior school year. And these are for students who are up to 13% of the school district's population. For the students who exceed the 13% threshold for the school district or charter school, Category 21 was established and is identified to have an additional $1.5 million for each fiscal year to serve these students. Lastly, in Category 20 is the Special Education Contingency Account, which is identified according to statute to have $2 million available to school districts or charter schools who have students with special education needs who exceed their general budget and capacity for that year. They can request this funding through the Interim Finance Committee, and those funds, as I mentioned, are identified for $2 million in each fiscal year. And true to my promise, I am available for questions.
I truly appreciate that, Ms. Peterson. We are going to start with Senator Neal. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I have a couple questions. So although the intent of the pupil-centered funding plan is implemented by the legislature, that a pupil should receive the highest weight for which they're eligible, it appears that the weight for English language learners may be higher than special education. Given this, does the department have concerns with proposing to continue to exclude pupils with disability from the other weighted categories in which they may be eligible?
Megan Peterson for the record. Special education funding comes with a different set of challenges, and one of those would be what is often referred to as maintenance of effort, and I did want to provide some clarification around the different levels of that. And in terms of the state's obligation to the federal government, it's often actually referred to as maintenance of fiscal support, and in terms of school districts and charter schools, it's referred to as maintenance of effort. The delineation there is that the state has an obligation to maintain the same level of funding as was offered in the prior year, whereas for a school district or charter school, maintenance of effort can be calculated a number of different ways, including an aggregated total of funding provided versus a per pupil calculation. As a result, and because of those requirements that are tied to federal requirements, the funding is managed differently, and the weight as a result of funding and the number of students available can fluctuate.
Thank you for that. I want to dig into that a little bit on that maintenance of effort. So it's my understanding, like the effort is provide but not expend. But then when it comes to the districts or the LEAs, they're expected to expend. And so how do we make those, I guess, requirements work? Because technically the money you can provide but not have spend it, and then the federal government can pull back the money that's not expended. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Megan Peterson for the record. My understanding of it is expended. So we have expended, are expected to expend at the state level the same level of funding as the prior year. School districts and charter schools, as I mentioned, have a little more flexibility in terms of how the expended level is calculated, but it is still evaluated based on expenditure, which is why within the pupil-centered funding plan, we look at the base year expenditures for the LEAs.
Okay. So then let me ask you this. What are your thoughts on allowing special education students to receive other weighted funding for which they're eligible, trying to equal it out? Are you interested in?
Yeah, Superintendent Ebert, for the record, the funding that is available and determined by this body can be dispersed, special education, ELL, to your comments earlier, at risk. So those are all possibilities.
Thank you for that. And then I have a follow-up to that question around the state special education funding based on the prior fiscal year. Have you guys considered providing state special education funding to school districts using a different method, such as the per capita basis, based on the number of special education pupils?
Megan Peterson, for the record. I'm trying to go back in my memory. I believe it was 2015 when the state updated its special education funding methodology. And so over the past few biennia, we have been working to work out that methodology. We are currently working on with other subject matter experts to evaluate options for special education funding to see what is going to best serve our state.
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, we actually have going to Board of Examiners a proposed contract to bring in someone to look at the formula for special education because it has been a while since that has been looked at as a state.
Thank you for that. So I think what I haven't heard is, so in the proposal, what are you asking them to look at? Because then that would make my follow-up question make sense, because I can't ask you, because I'm not sure what they're examining, right? What formula is being looked at? I propose the per capita basis, but are you looking at something else?
Megan Peterson, for the record, that is what we are going to work with the subject matter experts to identify. Currently, the allocation methodology maintains the prior year allocation at the school district level, and then any additional funding that is not used to maintain that level is distributed on a per pupil rate for those students with IEPs.
So whatever you're intending on looking at, that's going to examine the prior year funding, how would that affect the maintenance of effort standard that you're under? Is that being thought about too? Because it seems to be, it's conjunctive, right? So can you talk about that a little bit? I don't know if you can, because there's a big question mark on the what.
Megan Peterson, for the record, that is exactly what we are going to be looking at with the subject matter experts. And because they are experts in that field, they are familiar with the requirements of maintenance of effort and maintenance of state fiscal support. And so evaluating what options are available and making sure that we honor that requirement is all part of the conversation that will transpire.
Okay, not to make this worse, but I'm going to make it worse. Final question. So in this conversation of the unknown formula that you're considering, is there a conversation with the Board of Examiners, or in the proposal that we haven't seen, how you're going to create equity? I don't know if I should say equal education for these students, or an equitable education, because they are different words. But I think what's going through my mind right now is that a special education child doesn't necessarily change per se, depending on the disability that may be present. You have an ADD child, and then you have a severely disabled child, which is very different in terms of the growth, the movement, and how they're served throughout their educational career. And so how is equity, I guess, being examined in the proposal, or points that are being made?
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, thank you for the question, Senator Neal. Those are all pieces of what we're looking at, and it will not, I guess I need to be crystal clear, that this work will not be finished prior to the legislative body timeline. Just like the funding formula itself, right? We took 2 years with the Commission on School Funding, had many, many discussions on all the variables that have been discussed here today. So this work will start in the spring and then continue to move forward. But everything that you've brought up is part of the conversation, also in alignment with all of our federal requirements. and the current resources that we have as a state.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Those are all my questions.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll go to Senator Gansert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just want to follow up on some of the questions that Senator Neal had. So in looking at the funding, I understand the maintenance of effort, and so what happens if your denominator or your enrollment grows, the dollars per student declines. And so I think when you look at charter schools, when I'm looking at the numbers in our materials, because charter schools have grown so much, it looks like the special ed funding is only about $2,600 per student, whereas the average for the entire special ed population is somewhere between $4,100 to $4,200. That's $1,500 or $1,600 short. And you just said you're going to do a study on the funding, and I recognize, again, the maintenance of effort is what happened per district, and then your enrollment changes, so your per student changes. What would it cost to catch everyone up to the overall average of special ed funding in this biennium, given that we don't have that report, and because some funding is significantly different depending upon if you're in the general population or if you're a special ed. And I know the gifted and talented, we have one school there is also significantly lower per pupil funding.
Megan Peterson, for the record, we can get those numbers to you after the presentation today.
Thank you. That would be very helpful. And it's my understanding that this has been an ongoing problem, whether it's using our new funding formula or the past funding formula, and that we have used sort of catch-up dollars, maybe around 2017, that some monies were added to special ed funding, and they became ongoing dollars to try to make sure that we're treating students, that since we have a model we're trying to follow the students, that we have funding that is equal or equitable, not sure which, but closer for each type of population. So I appreciate those numbers.
I just want to make sure we don't have any further questions from any of our committee members. Okay. Well, with that, we can go ahead and close this budget item. And I thank you, Superintendent Ebert and Ms. Peterson and everyone else that contributed to today's presentation. And we will move on to public comment. And for ease, allowing our guests to leave the front, we could start in Las Vegas. And I don't believe I see anyone moving there. So we'll give it a second, and then we can go ahead and start here in Carson City with public comment. I would just ask if you guys can keep it to 2 minutes each, that'd be greatly appreciated, and we'll allow for 15 minutes of public comment. Thank you so much. We'll go ahead and start with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, committee members. For the record, my name is Marie Nices, and I'm the president of the Clark County Education Association. I'm here today to speak in support of the proposed K-12 education budget. The governor's commitment to use our state's historic budget surplus to put $2 billion into the pupil-centered funding plan, including fully funding the weights for English language learners, at-risk students, and gifted and talented students is unprecedented. With more than $2,000 in new funding per pupil, there is no reason we cannot improve student outcomes. To ensure that, however, we agree with the governor, there has to be accountability measures in place. To that end, we would also like to applaud Democratic leadership's recently announced plan to mandate transparency and accountability for school districts. We look forward to hearing how school districts plan to use these unprecedented funds to improve student achievement across our state. Thank you for your time.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Sarah Adler, Silver State Government Relations, representing a collection of Washoe County charter schools. So we very much appreciate the discussion that you had on the at-risk metrics. We want to point out that with graduation risk being the goal, we are concerned that needs at lower grade levels are undervalued by the metrics that are present, and Senator Neal made a vigorous point there, which we would support. The other thing we want to say is that, as Monroe Moreno spoke to, districts can aggregate that whatever at-risk funding comes and then deploy it, but charter schools have much smaller population bodies. They don't have that aggregation distribution, same opportunity. To Assemblywoman Miller's point about EL students, kids do. The EL measurement is WIDA, and some of the schools we represent are very successful at that. But what they would say is that you really don't gain fluency until years after you've hit the WIDA point. So that leads to Zellerman Yeager's point about at-risk and EL students being together. And we need to kind of hope that EL students are still at risk in order to be receiving some additional support within the school where they are. Last on that point, Title I is another measure of poverty besides free and reduced lunch. And I didn't hear that discussion in the at-risk discussion. That's it. I'll stop for today. Thank you.
Good morning, legislatures. My name is Jennifer Malater, and I have been working at Dilworth, a Title I middle school in Washoe County for 13 years. I am pleading for an increase in funding for education, especially teachers' salaries, by a minimum of 20%. As a wife and mother with a master's degree, we could not afford to send our eldest son to college, and he ended up joining the National Guard so that the military could pay for his university. Although his dream has always been Army, he wanted to wait until his degree was finished so he could be an officer rather than an officer enlist. The wages I had been paid for much of his life did not allow me to support my own child in his educational journey. Additionally, I have been physically assaulted directly twice by students and indirectly more times than I can count, because there's simply not enough educators in the building to properly monitor and manage behavior. Why would anyone come to teach in Nevada, when even with a $2 billion increase still puts this state at 30% below the national average? Per pupil funding is abysmal, which impacts the student performance statewide. My two younger boys are in kindergarten and second grade, sharing the same special education teacher, which is unjust to my boys as their grade levels are drastically different. We need to recruit and retain our teachers, but how is that possible when someone with my degree can go into another field and make a significant amount more money without the fear of being assaulted at work? There are countless stands Nevada must take to change the trajectory of our education system, and it has to start now. There is an ample amount of funds in the Education Stabilization Account, with more being put into it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is the rainiest of rainy days in our state's history. These funds should be used today to support the Time for 20 as well as the Respect for Educators Act. If we can get more adults in the building and classrooms, then we could actually teach without the decline of behaviors in our own mental health. Being able to teach will increase our student performance, but with such shortfalls, anything less than 20%, there will not be gains in Nevada. It's not that we aren't trying, there's just not enough of us.
Good morning, lawmakers. Thank you for allowing me to speak here today. My name is Justin Javinas. I'm a special education teacher in the Strategies program at Galena High School in Reno. I am also a member of the Washoe Educators Association. I'm a co-teacher of the self-containment program of students in the autism spectrum that have moderate to severe deficits in social, emotional, and communication skills. I'm here today to tell you my story. As a child, I was diagnosed with pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, which is someone that has difficulties in social and language development. I needed a lot of help growing up. I required a one-on-one aid from grades 1 through 11, and I also had speech and language services in school and private services for 14 years. I wasn't supposed to talk, learn, make friends, or even go to college. In fact, I did all those. On top of that, I earned a master's degree in special education. I am married with 2 children, and I own a home in Reno. I have all this because of the educators that have inspired me to be where I am. I want to help young children with disabilities like I do. Children with disabilities need love, care, and appropriate education, just like I had. I work with students that can be violent, and I've hurt other people, including myself. This is because they do not have the ability to manage their emotions, and it would take a long time for them to learn how to. I have also had the students escape the school, and I've had to make sure they didn't run to the street and get hit by a car, or even suspended for violence against peers and staff. There are students that use an assistive technology device to communicate at a minimal level. I even have students that need occasional diaper change. Because of the dedication, the effort I put in my craft, my students love being in school. In fact, they're even well liked by their peers, teachers, school staff, and administrators at Galena High School. I am also here today because I want to emphasize how important it is for you all to help public school educators of all roles. Due to the lack of investment in our education system, we are on the brink of peril. We are losing too many teachers in our schools in Nevada and all over the country. This system is not allowing people with reason to become a teacher. In fact, there are even teachers talking people out of being a teacher in the public school system. Why should teachers continue to teach when they're not being supported by their local and state government?
I don't want to cut you off, but you've kind of gone beyond 2 minutes. But if you could submit your statement in writing, that'd be greatly appreciated. We'll move to the next public comment.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Jessica Fernani. I have a master's degree in education, and I am an elementary special education resource teacher in Washoe County School District. This is my 6th year in education, and there really hasn't been a single year that I haven't contemplated leaving. I'm making public comment here today because my special education students need more support than I alone, or really any special educator like my colleague here, can give them. Nevada has a critical staffing crisis, particularly in SPED. The amount of education time spent working outside of contract hours, large caseloads, time spent dealing with dangerous students for those in self-contained rooms, and so on, far exceeds that of a school psychologist, for example, who is paid a triple-digit salary on average. The starting pay for a teacher in special education in Washoe County is $41,000 with a bachelor's degree. A colleague of mine has a caseload of 44 resource students when the cap is 23. That is nearly 100% over max. This is unacceptable. I am calling on the legislature to support special education educators and students by increasing funding per pupil, increasing pay for special education educators, including paraprofessionals, and decreasing max caseloads so teachers can work in a safe and productive environment. This can be done by utilizing money in the Rainy Day Education Fund to increase all teacher salaries, as well as to increase the percent that the state pays towards special education students. Every day I see small miracles unfold before my eyes, watching an intellectually disabled student read for the first time, seeing students pass general education tests, to name a few. These miracles are the result of hard work and grit. With more funding, though, in place for teachers and students will grow even more. For now, though, teachers in special education and education in Nevada in general are treading in a house that is flooding with water, but the ceiling keeps getting closer and we are running out of air. Thank you.
Hello. My name is my name is Pablo. I'm a first year of a guest teacher for Washoe County School District. Hundreds of teachers in state of Nevada packed into the valley on February 10th, demanding legislature to fix our troubled school and raise the education funding. None of this started outrage at the number of students who don't have a licensed teacher. Many school districts relies on substitute teacher and guest teacher to fill in the classroom when many certified teachers resign or who being sick all the week long due to personal and health reasons, due to broken education system. This education shortage caused many administrative council to create more students into one classroom. For example, when I studied at Huck High School, I was shocked to see what there is 35 to 40 plus students in my classroom. I asked myself that does Huck is overcrowded, or does the school was because of a school was built last year. This is a brand new school. I experienced having a large classroom size of over sometimes 25, 30, 35, 40 students in one classroom. It's not such Huck, but it's all across the school, such like North Valley, Reed, and Reno High School. This will affect my teachability and my classroom management. So some students will likely not pay attention to someone who needs help. That sign means I have a largest class size in the nation. This also increases student behavior as a result that many staff and teacher aides are leaving, and many of them don't want to apply for this position because their pay rate is very low, $12 per hour. This will result many students who may not able to learn or have a trauma that lead to attack teacher. That's happened in Dilworth Middle School in December. I will ask you to please increase the education funding, not lower education requirement. This funding is not such waste teacher salary, but increase staff, teacher assistant, and higher mental health to support student as well as combat student behavior. Decreases class size to 20 students per classroom. Increase student learning environment, such like a new bus ride and many more.
Thank you so much. We have time for 2 more public comment. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brent Busboom. I'm in my 24th year of teaching, 21 of them at Reno High School. During my 24 years, I've won numerous awards, including Teacher of the Year. My students consistently have some of the highest AP English scores in the state, and I say this not to impress you, but to impress upon you that I take education seriously. I want you to think seriously about education, because my argument, simply put, is this. Teachers don't want to teach in Nevada. Want proof? In 2015, Nevada had a statewide teacher shortage of 1,000 teachers. 7 years later, in 2022, it almost tripled to 2,700. Let me tell you about my daughter. She's 18 years old. She's never had a B in her life. Her SATs are in the high 1300s. She's great with kids. She's a catch. She's even thought about going into teaching. But in her words, there is no way I will ever teach in Nevada. Well, let me tell you about my current student teacher. She's smart. She knows how to connect with students. Her work ethic, it's extraordinary. She's even bilingual. But she doesn't want to teach in Nevada. She's looking out of state. There's thousands of people like my daughter and my student teacher, people who would make amazing teachers, but they don't want to teach in Nevada. Look, here's the deal. The governor wants to set aside billions of dollars, either in a rainy day fund or in a stabilization account, but I guarantee you one thing, and you can take this to the bank, it's raining now. Over the last 3 years, if you include 2023, inflation has been 19.9%. So let me be clear. If you don't fund education high enough to let districts give us a 20% raise, it's a pay cut. If you give us a 15% raise, it's a pay cut. 17%, pay cut. 19%, it's a pay cut. Do you want more teachers to leave? Then remember, if it's not 20%, it's a pay cut. Thank you.
Buenos dias. Good morning. My name is Nicolette Andrini. I'm a 7th and 8th grade Spanish teacher at DePoli Middle School in Reno. I wanted to make public comment to show you my longevity in teaching. I started when I was 19 years old. I got my sublicense. I've worked at Title I schools, Roger Corbett, Echo Loader, in elementary school. I've also taught after-school Spanish at Hunsberger and Collin Ranch and Roy Gom. So I loved teaching so much when I was 19, got my sublicense, and fast forward, I've had my own classroom for 18 years. I wanted to retire as a 30-year teacher, as my mother did. She was also a middle school Spanish teacher, 30 years at Dilworth Middle School. I can't do it. I love my job and I love the kids. And when I teach Spanish, my approach is to bond with the child. And at middle school, I see them as the whole child, and I feel like I'm their counselor, and I really care about their mental health. Then they learn Spanish. They can't learn with subs constantly in and out. I get called to cover other classes where there's vacancies, and I'm happy to do so, but those kids don't know me. And I'm in a classroom of 35 to 40, and they don't respond. It's just a waste of time. And then I go back and I lose my prep period because I'm helping a colleague because we can't get subs. So I just wanted to back up that we do need a 20% raise. We absolutely do. Me in my 18th year of teaching, and I look at the salary schedule, I'm not gonna be able to retire in 30 years. I'm not gonna make it. I'm looking at options after this year, just to stay afloat. So I hope that everybody here has heard our stories and takes that into account. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And we kind of forgot, but we do have individuals on the phone on BPS. If you can gear up the first caller, but I just want to stress to those on the phone, please limit your comments to 2 minutes. Thank you so much.
To provide public comment, press *9 on your phone or raise your hand in the Zoom app now to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last three digits of 653, you may begin. Caller with the last three digits of 653, please press *6 now to unmute yourself.
My apologies. This is Dora Martinez representing the Nevada Disability Peer Action Coalition. I'll make it quick. Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and the rest of the amazing hardworking committee. Kudos to Senator Nielsen. Yes, equity is important, and you are absolutely right in every point of your statement. As a blind mom with non-disabled students, with friends who have disabled students, I hear horrible stories. It is time that these Washoe County folks need to be held accountable, and transparency is important. None of those money that they bring down even touches the children. I have friends who are IEP teachers who have, like what the other commenter was saying, overload work. And they are forced to sign a contract saying that, yes, that they met the student, when they haven't even met the student, so they left the job. So please, let the accessibility not be an afterthought. And the case point is that your website is not accessible. As a blind mom, with this digital time that we're doing, I cannot even keep track of what my kids are doing. So shame on you to come over there and say that you're doing everything you can, when sometimes you cannot even provide the items that these senators and assembly people are asking for. Where do you think you're going to go? You think you're going to go to school and be in the classroom? You're in the building. Provide what they need, and we really want to see that as a parent and as a Special Education Advisory Committee member. Thank you.
Can we go to the next caller? And also,
Caller with the
I also want to let those people that are on the phone, please, if you can, also submit your comments in writing. We are having a difficult time hearing everybody, and we appreciate you taking this time, and we'd love to be able to also be able to circulate back and read those. But if we can go to the next caller, that'd be appreciated.
Caller
Good
with the-
morning. Good morning. I want to appreciate everyone who's taking their time in person today to be there through all this weather. My name is Emily Riggin, and I'm a public educator in Carson City. I teach at Carson High School. And I just wanted to take an opportunity to illustrate the reality of the teaching that is happening in this current climate. My high school English classes are overly crowded with more students than I can adequately serve. I do not teach honors classes. I choose to teach struggling students, but my classes are full of the lowest and neediest students, and every one of my 30 desks are full. That's a ratio of 30 to 1, with at least a third of these students struggling with basic literacy skills due to learning disabilities, language acquisition, mental health concerns, and unstable home lives. The strain of staff shortages means that the resources that could be used to support student learning are stretched further and further and are not enough. But how do we attract people to this difficult and demanding job when new teachers can make more money as assistant managers at Forever 21? Such is the choice that the student teacher who is interning down the hall from me is having to make. Our students are, are suffering from this deficiency that stems from the state funding. I see it every day, and it wears on my soul, and I love this profession. I feel helpless in my capacity to effectively reach all of these students. How do we persevere in the face of failure? So I'm asking the committee to consider the Time for 20, redirecting all possible funds to education in order to support Nevada's future, because public education is the net by which we can support all individuals in the state. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Melinda Remersma, and I am a third grade teacher at Sonoma Heights Elementary School in Winnemucca. I am also the president of UCN, representing all of the certified and classified staff in our 15 rural counties. While I'm appreciative of the governor for recognizing the importance of public education and proposing a $2 billion increase to education funding, unfortunately, the proposal misses the mark for actually making a long-term difference in the education of our students in Nevada. As NSDA has pointed out, due to inflation, all the increase will be doing is giving a minimal increase to per pupil spending, which is thousands of dollars short of the optimal funding our students deserve. On top of that, our rural districts, who are now in hold harmless under the new funding formula, will not see anywhere close to the increase of $2,000 per student. This will ultimately keep us far from the optimal funding amount. Not only is this going to make it very difficult for us to negotiate any type of salary increase for our current teachers, but it will also harm our efforts to recruit new teachers to our rural districts. This is my 17th year teaching in my district. It is my husband's 19th year and my mom's 18th year. We all have master's degrees and student loan debt. We are all back to living paycheck to paycheck due to inflation. Quite honestly, we have talked about the possibility of needing to find a different profession or even having to leave our community altogether. The Commission on School Funding was tasked by this body with determining what optimal funding was for our state. After years of work, they have met that objective and presented their plan to the legislature. Now it is time for you to implement their recommendations. In doing so, you will bring us one step closer to Time for 20, which invests in all of our students by ensuring competitive pay for all of our educators across the entire state, so that we can ensure our educators stay in the profession and, perhaps more importantly, enter the profession. Our students deserve to have highly qualified educators, and those highly qualified educators deserve to be paid their worth. Investing in educators is an investment into the education of our youth. Thank you for your time.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and committee members. My name is Carrie Finn, and I work as a clinical aide in the health office at Pioneer Academy in Carson City. I'm also the president of the Carson Educational Support Association. I am speaking today in support of the Time for 20 campaign. Without education support professionals such as bus drivers, bus attendants, clinical aides, nurses, paraprofessionals, nutrition workers, custodians, IT workers, administrative assistants, librarians, and building, ground, and maintenance workers, schools cannot operate properly. Teachers cannot be the teachers they need to be, and students cannot get the education they deserve. Education support professionals keep our schools healthy, safe, and engaged so that they will be ready to learn. We have all witnessed firsthand the awesome impact these dedicated professionals have had on every student they encounter. Each one is a positive role model and plays a key role in making our public schools great for every student. Too many education support professionals earn below poverty level wages and have to work 2 or even 3 jobs just to make ends meet. It sadly speaks of the income levels when we have education support professionals living in their cars or in campgrounds. Time for 20 isn't a campaign for raises. It's a campaign for a living wage, which I think really changes the narrative. Without proper funding to retain and hire these professionals, districts are losing them at a rapid pace. People who might be interested in these positions are finding better paying jobs elsewhere and a much safer working environment. Education support professionals go into education because they have a passion for working with students, but they must also be able to support their families. In closing, please consider the ramifications to education across the state of Nevada by not having education support professionals in schools due to a lack of proper funding for all districts. Thank you for your consideration.
To provide public comment, press star 9 on your phone now to take your place in the queue. Once more, to provide public comment, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue.
Hello, my name is Darby Beckwith, and I am a drama and English teacher at Carson High School. I am a native Nevadan who graduated from Story County School District in 2015. I became a teacher largely because I was raised to value education, Both of my parents have worked in education in various Nevada school districts their entire adult lives. As both an employee and a product of Nevada public education, I urge you to support Time for 20 in this legislative session. I have seen firsthand how teaching can be an incredibly rewarding career path. Unfortunately, it no longer seems to be a sustainable one. A national teacher shortage has left our Nevada schools scrambling to hire and retain educators. There is no way around it. Nevada schools are in a crisis. We must invest in public education. The role of public schools in our communities is indispensable, and now is the opportunity to make a commitment to our young people and provide them with educational equity by allocating the resources necessary to recruit and retain quality educators. Until education is treated as a respected institution, our vulnerable students will continue to slip through the cracks. I was compelled to call in and make a public comment today for many reasons, but ultimately, I want to show my students that I believe in their futures, and I know they deserve more than they are currently being provided in our current system. In my classroom, I teach my students to be leaders, to speak up and stand up for what is right, to advocate for change when they see injustices in the world. And today, I am leading by example. I urge you to do the same. It's long past time for 20. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I just wanted to intercept. I appreciate all those that called in and those that came to give public comment today. We do have to get downstairs, so I would ask that anyone who did not be able to give public comment today definitely submit it in writing. We do have a stack of letters we received, and we appreciate hearing from our educators and our educator support professionals, and we're getting those redacted, and we'll get those circulated to each of the members. And with that, we'll go ahead and close today's subcommittee hearings. Thank you.